Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we will be watching Harald Hardrada Part 2, The Last Viking by History Dose. Last time we saw Harald Hardrada fleeing Norway and serving in the Byzantine Varangian Guard, where he actually played a pretty important role in Byzantine politics of the era. Now, this video was requested by one of our wonderful patrons. If you would like to request a reaction or see my exclusive reaction content, then please check out my Patreon. It is linked down below. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction. The return, okay. He's heading back to his homeland after, like I said, a stint in the Varangian Guard, getting a lot of experience, a lot of money. Now he has the resources to go back home.
Around the year 1044, as a Yuletide frost crept over the north, King Magnus of Norway brought fire and death to Denmark. Thralls abandoned the burning halls of their fallen masters. Men were slain before their kin, their wives and children carried away as plunder. The invaders sought the rebel Jarl called Svein, for the Danes had raised him as their sovereign king to supplant the foreign rule of King Magnus. Upon the death of Canute the Great and later Canute's son, King Magnus had inherited a claim to the thrones of England and Denmark, and though he would not insist on pursuing the former, his reign over the latter was now recognized in blood and ash.
Yeah, well, if we look at Scandinavia and or the Nordic states, oftentimes one would rule the others or there would be fighting in betwixt them, so this was a pretty common thing. Now, the claim to the throne of England, that is a little more unusual, and that will continue to play a role in this story.
Spain's warriors lay scattered throughout the land, drifting dead in the cold tide or crouched in shadowed woods. Spain found refuge at the friendly court of the King of Sweden, and Magnus the Good was hailed as the true and noble king of Norway and Denmark. Talk of post-mortem miracles surrounded his late father, the fervent Christian King Olaf, revered now as a saint. So great were the armies of Magnus, so holy his claim to the throne, that there seemed none left in all the land to oppose him. A gale howled over the seas, waves swelled before a stranger ship.
I mean, look, having that sort of Christian credibility in a Christianizing Europe, that can give you a lot of power, influence, and a lot of clout. Not only in Scandinavia, but throughout the rest of Europe. It's also a geopolitical move, of course.
Here sailed the bane of great kings, a Viking long ago banished from this land. Uncle to Magnus, brother to Saint Olaf. This was the mercenary Harald Sigurdsson, returned to take the crown of Norway.
There he is. And to be honest, though, of course, Harald's story is remarkable. He is a truly fascinating historical figure. This path is not necessarily an uncommon one for a Viking leader. You know, maybe you leave your homeland, maybe you've been kicked out or you're forced to flee, or maybe you just leave seeking riches, loot, plunder. Harald leaves. Like many Vikings, he serves abroad in many foreign lands, acquires that loot and plunder he was looking for, and once he has more money, more power, he heads back home to reassert himself. In many ways, this was sort of the way a lot of these Viking leaders did things.
He sojourned at the Swedish court, and there he unloaded strange and innumerable treasures. For roughly 15 years had passed since he fled Scandinavia from that battlefield where his brother Olaf fell, and he had since won glory and riches in the land of the Rus in the Byzantine Empire as the hired champion of princes and emperors.
Yeah, and though Byzantine power has been in decline for hundreds and hundreds of years, it is not the impressive, all-conquering Roman Empire that it once was. It is still a very prosperous state with a lot of history and a lot of important artifacts to to bring some of that loot, some of that plunder back home would still have been a very impressive thing.
That autumn, when Magnus and his men were along the coast, they were struck by the approach of Harald's magnificent ship.
Hey!
King
Look at
Magnus
him.
received his uncle with guarded cordiality. The Grand Prince of Kiev had recently betrothed his fair daughter Elisaveta to Harald, and so it was seen that Harald possessed riches greater than King Magnus himself, a wife of status, and a blood claim to the throne. Harald asked Magnus how he wished to divide the rule of Norway between them. Magnus answered that he was obliged to consult with his advisors on the matter. His chief advisor then stepped forward. This old enemy of Olaf, Einar Thumbar-Skelfir, chastised Harald. "We are not keen to be divided between two kings. We have always served one king, and so it must remain for as long as King Magnus continues to reign."
Alright, well, I guess we'll see if that happens. Look, whether or not you want to divide the rule, whether or not you want two kings, I will tell you, Harald is a serious, serious threat to the reign of King Magnus. So I would be careful with what you're saying here.
Harald returned in shame to Sweden. If his enemies would not see him as king, they would suffer him as a warrior.
Yeah, come on now, returned in shame to Sweden. I don't know if it was shame. He's gone the diplomatic route. He's gone the nice route. He's been refused. Harald is still gonna get what he wants. Spooky. Part 2. Vengeance. Oh my.
Dragon ships cast onto the shore, and Northmen swept over the land at the command of Svein and Harald. The two men had sworn an oath of allegiance. Together they would seize Denmark for Svein and Norway for Harald. Towns became screaming pyres. They hacked men to death and tore wailing women from lowly huts. And it was said, "Few were they of escape to tell, for sorrow-worn the people fell. The only captives from the fray were lovely maidens led away. And in wild terror to the strand, down to the ships the linked band of fair-haired girls is roughly driven, their soft skins by the irons riven."
Oh, what a nice little poem.
Tidings of war reached Magnus, and the king...
I love getting a poetic and beautiful description of war crimes. You gotta love that. Of course, you know, once again, remember the context. A lot of this brutality was pretty normal, especially for the Vikings. They were sort of famous for their brutality, so it's not like this is uniquely bad, but, you know, it's just sort of a funny way to present it to us.
The king's council did not think it wise to oppose Harald, and so messengers passed in secret between Magnus and Harald to negotiate the co-rulership of Norway between them.
Wow.
Svein suspected betrayal. He attempted to assassinate Harald in his sleep, but Harald escaped. And at long last, he was crowned King Harald III of Norway.
There you go. He's taken up his rightful position. After years, I believe they said 15 years, was it, away serving in the Byzantine Empire, serving in a pretty prominent position, playing an important role in the court politics of that empire, he has now returned to his own country and taken his role at the top.
As co-ruler, Magnus insisted on being the primary king, granted precedence in courtly matters and ritual. Magnus was beloved by his people for his leniency and generosity, and for this Harald
That's nice.
resented him as weak and childish.
Oh.
The two insulted each other with impunity, but still a greater danger united them. They moved against Svein in Denmark, and there, in the fall of the year 1047, Magnus was said to have been gripped by an illness. With his waning strength, Magnus declared that the sole rule of Norway would pass to Harald, and Denmark given over to Svein. King Magnus the Good then died.
Wow. I mean, hey, King Magnus the Good. That's a pretty nice title to have. Known for your generosity and kindness. That's definitely not a bad thing, but he is gone. And now Harald is sole ruler of Norway. I wonder if he's going to do anything about Denmark.
Harald did not think himself bound by the wishes of dying kings.
Right, of
At
course.
once he made preparations to move with haste against Svein and claim the throne of Denmark.
Not much of a surprise. I mean, I don't think Harold felt himself really bound by anything, as we've seen. So, did you really think that decree from the dying King Magnus was going to stop him from further conquest? I don't think so.
The king's assembly, Einar, openly declared that he himself would return to bury Magnus in Norway, and that he would rather serve Magnus dead than any other king alive.
Yeah, okay.
The fighting men loyal to the chieftain Einar were so numerous and his influence so great that Harald had little choice but to tolerate such treasonous speech.
Oh, wow.
And return
Okay.
to assert his rule over Norway. For the high thrones of Scandinavia had not entirely supplanted the power of the Viking halls. Kings
Right.
were still obliged to reckon with the old war clans of every region.
Yeah, I kind of thought Harold was going to toss that guy out, but they are making a good point. You know, they talked about how we have one king of Norway, not two. But what is true is that there is still a lot of decentralization of power. The king has a lot of power, that is certainly true, but he has other bases of power he has to contend with, these old warrior clans. And so they may not necessarily bow unconditionally to the king. So this is not necessarily an absolute monarchy, absolutely not. Just because Harold has this position doesn't mean he can do whatever he wants. He has other people still to contend with.
Svein was raised as the king of the Danes, and when Harald went to ravage Denmark in the summer, Svein eluded capture. Harald returned to Norway and married a second wife, Thora of the influential Arnesen family. While his wives would bear him children to be raised as heirs to Norway, the king's gaze turned ever south.
Wow, a second wife. So was that normal in this culture? I assume so, but maybe not. I'm not familiar with sort of the marriage culture of Scandinavia, or I guess particularly Norway at this time. I would have assumed monogamy was normal, but that's an assumption based on nothing, so maybe maybe it was just powerful men, I don't know, were taking multiple wives. Anyone who knows a bit about that can comment down below.
In 1050, he returned to terrorize Denmark. His Vikings tore over farmland, ruined villages, and burned churches. They tortured people to death, violated women, and burned the trading post of Hedeby. When Svein at last met Harald with a massive army, Harald fled. In Norway, Harald moved.
You know, Harold's really been in and out so far. He goes into Denmark, doesn't achieve much, comes back, goes in, raids a whole lot. Svein approaches with an army. Well, I'm heading back to Norway. Are we going to get a big encounter eventually? That's what I'm waiting for.
To punish and assassinate those who questioned his rule. Yet Einar stood at the head of a mighty faction of chieftains who freely decried the king's butchery. At length, Harald requested a meeting with Einar to resolve the matter. Einar stepped alone into the king's chamber and remarked how dark the room was. A few of Harald's men then emerged from the shadows and killed him.
I had to say it, Einar, you should have seen this coming. You're decrying Harold for his butchery, his brutality. In contrast to Magnus the Good, he invites you to a personal meeting, and you didn't see that you're about to get slaughtered? I mean, that is really in bad faith. Like I said, Harold, clearly nothing holds this man back. He does not adhere to any sort of convention. He does whatever the hell he wants. But Einar, come on, man, use your head.
Einar's son rushed in to the aid of his father, and they killed him too. The people came to despise King Harald, and there was wide talk of rebellion among the farmers. The king tasked his ally, Finn Arnesen, to entreat them to peace. Finn requested the king offer something in exchange for so dangerous a quest: the safe return of his brother, Kulf. Kulf Arnesen was the greatest traitor to Harald's house. He was said to have personally killed Olaf. When Magnus learned of this crime years ago, Kulf fled into exile to the Norwegian domains along the northern edge of Scotland. Harald now welcomed Kulf back to Norway and restored him to his old estates.
Wow.
Then, in the summer, King Harald went on campaign in Denmark and demanded that Kulf make the first assault against the Danish position.
By the way, As someone who's from Scotland, not that I've been up to the Northern Isles that much, but I do always think it's interesting, Shetland, Orkney, and then of course outside of Scotland, but sort of even further north, you have the Faroe Islands. I always think some of those islands that have a lot of that Nordic, Norse influence are really fascinating. That sort of combination of cultures, some of the Scottish islands, this sort of odd combination of Scottish culture and Norse culture, where you can see some differences in language and culture and tradition, really interesting stuff. I've never been up there, but I think it would be interesting to visit.
Only after Culf was overrun and killed with his men did Harald land with reinforcements. Finn and all the people saw plainly the treachery of their vengeful king. Harald wrote that he took pride in having given the death stroke to 2 more of his enemies. The king burned and pillaged regions whose fealty wavered, and there were rumors that he stole offerings set by the faithful at the tomb of Saint Olaf.
Jesus. I mean, I guess I shouldn't be surprised for, the quote-unquote last Viking, but I didn't know Harald was such a brutal character, my goodness. I mean, not only is he effective, confident, competent, and efficient in warfare, but this man is absolutely cruel and brutal.
Though he raised great churches and the kingdom outwardly prospered, the people in coming centuries would know him as Hardrada, the hard ruler. For years he shed the blood of so many foes, but
that's what that title means.
Still the hated Svein of Denmark remained.
Part 3, The Enemy King.
Harald commanded 150 longships south, plundering shores which in those days belonged to the Danes. Then, near the mouth of the river Nissa, the men were taken by the sight of a fleet twice their size.
Oh.
Spain had come to answer the king's challenge to war. In this land, the late summer sun lingers long in the sky, and the embers of twilight burn on the horizon even in the darkest hour. In the shadowy haze, Harald stirred his men to battle. Each fleet was lashed together with ropes and chains to hold the lines, and they crashed forward. Arrows and spears were flung into shields, chests, and heads. Untethered Norwegian ships then outflanked the Danes, and a slaughter began on the decks.
Alright, I mean, we're getting that big battle I asked for. And I feel like I often have to highlight when watching these videos the quality of History Doses content. Both the art, I mean, their art is really exceptional. I mean, there's a lot of channels with good art out there, but I do think History Dose sort of goes quite a bit above the average. They have some fantastic art. Also, the writing, the way they describe things, they just do a great job with stuff like this. I say History Dose is a pretty underrated channel, honestly.
The Danes threw themselves overboard, and Harald took 70 of their ships. In the sea of gashed bodies, his warriors captured alive Finn Arneson, who had betrayed Harald to serve Svein. Harald decided to spare him. At any rate, King Svein had escaped the battle and regrouped.
A rare bit of mercy from Harald. You didn't expect to see that, huh?
The two kingdoms had been drained by war, and within 2 years, Harald brokered unconditional peace with Svein. Harald would remain in Norway, content to maim and kill the people of defiant regions.
Yeah, Norway and Denmark, they have really been going back and forth, but that is kind of what I said earlier. These Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, they'd go back and forth, fighting each other, trying to conquer each other, plundering and raiding and conquering the rest of Europe as well. Really a rowdy bunch, you could say, but you can imagine how draining that sort of warfare might be if you're constantly at each other's throats for such a long time.
And in this manner, he gained peace in his country by blood and fear.
Yeah.
The king would spend quiet hours composing poetry, pondering his own legacy. You may have heard tales of the distant Norsemen who reached North America some decades ago. He himself had journeyed far south as a mercenary. And as king, he explored north into glacial seas beyond the map's edge, realms surely host to wild beasts and ancient monsters. Of his voyages, it was written. The king finally had to turn back when the extreme limit of the world disappeared in fog before his eyes. He barely escaped the gaping ravine of the abyss.
Fascinating. I feel like that is sort of an underrated part of the Viking legacy. I mean, what is known about them, or I should say what is talked about, is usually the raiding, the looting, the plundering, and that's absolutely fair. But hey, there was a lot more to them than that. First off, there was the conquest. Oftentimes they would just raid, arrive at your shores, raid some monasteries or churches or whatever, and then leave. But sometimes they would stay. They would conquer, they would settle. I mean, you can look at Normandy, which will play a bit of a role later in this story. And there's also the exploration, of course, making it to North America, pretty famously. That's a real fascinating thing that I don't think gets enough attention. Their exploration throughout Europe and beyond to, like they said, the northern edges of the map, or what might be called the known world. Stuff that I really don't know much about either. I mean, this era of history is not my area of expertise, and especially the Vikings. I don't know much about them, but it feels like there's a lot of fascinating stuff that we often don't really talk about, because we're too focused on them fighting and raiding.
Harald had lived 50 winters, and the days of glorious and terrible war might have seemed but memories to an aging king. Yet one day a traveler came to his court. He was Tostig Godwinson, or an envoy on his behalf.
There we go.
Tostig had until recently ruled in the Kingdom of England as the Earl of Northumberland.
And now we're getting to this last part of Harald's story, and maybe the most famous part of his story. I think in the English-speaking world, he's probably best known for the role he plays in this whole thing. We're going to get to it.
But he had been a harsh ruler, and when the people rebelled against him, his rival brother Harald Godwinson succeeded in having him banished. And upon the death of the childless King Edward, the English High Council crowned Harald Godwinson the King of England.
Another
Jealous
Harald.
brother Tostig sought retribution, imploring Harald of Norway to conquer the country, to redeem Magnus's old claim to the English throne. Harald Hardrada could become the Viking King of England, and Tostig would regain land and power as his vassal.
Yeah.
So Harald prepared an army.
And that's got to be pretty enticing. I mean, they talked about how Harald has been thinking during the stability of his kingdom about his legacy, and now he gets this offer. Come and conquer a new kingdom, come and be king of England. The spot's open. He's been all across Europe. He's been to the northern reaches of the known world. He's fought with Denmark back and forth, never managed to conquer that kingdom. Now he gets another opportunity. Well, he might as well take it, but he's not the only one going for this position. There are a couple of contenders.
In dreams, dark omens came to the King of Norway and his followers. One man saw a great battle in England, and before him a witch riding a wolf. With bloody jaws, her beast devoured the carcasses of Harald's men, and she sang, "The troll woman sees clearly the doom awaiting Harald."
I mean, yeah, she was right. They should have heeded that warning, that bad omen. All right, part 4. The last journey. The last journey for the last Viking. 1066.
Grassy cliffs pulled high and quiet over the sea and sloped into little dwellings where people beheld a scowling fleet bearing an army of around 10,000 warriors. Harald and his Vikings buttressed by Tostig and some of his allies. Towns submitted to them readily, and when the village of Skartaborg stood against them, the Vikings tossed burning wood onto their houses and slaughtered the people. The invaders proceeded inland by river, far from the gaze of King Harald Godwinson, who was perched in the south with his army, anticipating an invasion from another claimant to the English crown.
Another claimant to the English crown. Who could that be?
William, Duke of Normandy.
There he
The
is.
Normans themselves.
William, as he would come to be known, the Conqueror. And, of course, I mentioned earlier, the Vikings didn't just raid, sometimes they settled. And that's exactly where Normandy came from. It came up from the Vikings settling in the area, well, being offered to settle there. And now you get this intermixing between Norse culture and French culture. And bing, bang, bong, there you go, you get the Normans. And, of course, back to Harald for a second, the Vikings had plenty of experience raiding the shores of England. This was not unfamiliar territory to them. They had a lot of experience sailing up and down the coast, sailing through the rivers of the country. So this was, maybe not particularly for Harald, but for the Vikings a little more broadly, pretty familiar territory.
Were the descendants of Viking raiders who over a century ago gained land along the French coast, mixing with indigenous Franks and adopting much of their customs.
Yeah.
For now, Harald met little resistance as his army neared the great city of York.
And though they had mixed with the indigenous culture, the Franks, and they had, of course, become far more French than they previously were, you can see the Normans still had that Viking fire in them. They still wanted to go out, raid, conquer, fight. I mean, especially William. But sort of that culture, once again, it was an interesting mix of the Franks and the Vikings, the Norse.
Whose weathered walls and towers were the traces of ancient times, when this country belonged to the shining legions of Rome.
Yeah.
The English would not now cower behind its walls. On September 20th, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria led their armies against the Viking horde near the marshlands. The invaders pummeled them wildly, and the corpses of Englishmen were scattered about the wet grass. Survivors fled. York and the whole of Northumbria resolved to surrender. The nobles would be spared violence, but made to guarantee their loyalty by offering their children to be held as hostages by the Vikings.
And this was not an entirely uncommon practice. In fact, it was a pretty regular practice when we look at the Middle Ages, before and even after the Middle Ages, but primarily this period we're looking at now. If there were two states in warfare with each other and some sort of treaty was signed at the end, the victorious state might take the child or children of the king of the state that it lost, or maybe some of the high lords of that state, take them as prisoners. Now, prisoners that would be treated very well, they'd be brought up well, they would be educated well, but nonetheless, they were being held as basically leverage. If you're this victorious state, and you've signed this treaty, now you can say, hey, we have the future of your leadership, the future of your aristocracy. If you want to mess with us again, then either we can kill them, or maybe even turn them against you. So this was a pretty common practice.
September 25th, Harald took 2/3 of his army, and leaving their mail armor behind due to the hot weather, they marched to the site chosen for the exchange of hostages, Stamford Bridge.
Yep, here we go. Now, this is actually the second most famous battle of 1066, only because the Battle of Hastings also occurred in this same year. If not for that, then this would by far be the most famous battle of this year. And it is a very important and very influential battle in English history and sort of in European history more broadly, though sometimes a little bit overshadowed by the Battle of Hastings, because, if people know one thing about this whole conflict, they probably know the Battle of Hastings. But if they know something else, they might know the Battle of Stamford Bridge.
A cloud of dust appeared in the distance. Having trekked 200 miles in 4 or 5 days, here was King Harald Godwinson and a great English army. Harald of Norway sent riders to summon the remaining third of his army over an hour's ride away. The English pushed onto the bridge. English chronicles would later tell that when his countrymen had fallen, one Viking held the bridge alone for some time, slaying dozens of English before he was killed.
Yeah, and this is a very well-remembered story from this whole battle. And, of course, it really plays into the whole Viking image, this very famous story about a single Viking holding the bridge against, I don't know, dozens, hundreds of Englishmen fighting until his last breath, holding them off for a ridiculous amount of time. And of course, like I said, it really plays into the Viking image of bravery, determination, ferocity, those sort of things.
Farther back, Harald Hardrada rode before his army, shouting that though they lacked armor, their hearts were fearless. The men rallied shield to shield in a
I mean, certainly true, they absolutely were fearless.
ring, spears planted forward, archers ready. The English cavalry charged and the Vikings repulsed them. The English infantry then crashed upon the edges, but the line held strong. At length the English retreated, and when the Viking front roared in pursuit, the English turned around to rush the gaps in their ranks. In this bloodied swelter, hewn limbs and heads piled underfoot, and dying screams rang out. Harald of Norway took up his rageful sword and slashed at his foes. It was said, neither helmet nor armor could withstand him, and all who were nearest gave way before him. And then an arrow struck through his throat, and King Harald Sigurdsson fell dead.
Those damn English bowmen, they're always giving the English the advantage. But you know, Harold, regardless of what else you think about him, this man was clearly a fierce and fearless warrior. Like I said, a competent and, brutal guy in many ways.
His men did not surrender. Of them it was written, the gallant men who saw him fall would take no quarter, one and all, resolved to die with their loved king around his corpse in a corpse ring.
I love the poetry.
The late arrival of reinforcements did not shift the tide of battle. Tostig was found dead with an arrow through his eye, and only a handful of ships loaded with shaken survivors would make the journey home to Norway.
Yeah, and it's absolutely commendable to keep fighting even after your king has fallen, in his memory, or whatever it was, in respect of him. But once Harald has fallen and Tostig has fallen, you know, even if the battle was to go a little bit better, or say a significant number of your men were to escape, what would you do then? I mean, it was Harald who was seeking a claim to the throne. It was him who was trying to take the position of king, and Tostig was supporting him. If those two were gone, then where exactly are you going to go from there? Not that that's even a situation they had to deal with, because, as they said, only a few shaken survivors even made it out.
The English tended to their wounds and gathered the dead. It seemed King Harald Godwinson had saved England, yet 3 days after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, William, Duke of Normandy, invaded with thousands of mighty warriors. The king hastened south with some of his army, and at the Battle of Hastings, the Normans vanquished the weary English.
Yeah, and now we get to the most famous battle of 1066, and a really consequential battle for England and sort of the English world as a whole, I guess you could say, because of course England and Britain will go on to affect the rest of the world, and this really changed the course of their history. You know, the English under Harald Godwinson, like they said, quickly made their way south, tired, you know, maybe not in full fighting shape after that battle with Harald Hardrada, fought against the Normans under William, lost, and then good old William the Conqueror and the Normans took over, profoundly shaping English culture, English language, English court life, and they brought a whole lot of French language, French culture, French customs to England that would really shape it in many ways into the country we know today.
Harald Godwinson was killed, the last of the Anglo-Saxon kings.
Yep.
William would cast out the old aristocracy, massacre rebels, and put himself on the throne. Now came the days of a new line of kings, a new age in England.
Absolutely.
The power of the crown was strengthened. Warfare would change as hundreds of grand castles rarely seen before in this land were raised. England would grow closer to continental Europe and more close to the depredations of Scandinavia. Spain would twice attempt a Danish invasion.
Yep. Like I said, following that Battle of Hastings, following the takeover from William the Conqueror that would really shape English history forever, and it would change a whole lot. As they said, England would draw closer to the continent for a long time to come, and you can really see that with the diplomacy and especially the wars between England and some of these continental countries, especially France. English culture would change, language would change, customs, especially amongst the elite. Now, a lot of those changes would trickle down to the common people, but when we are talking about a lot of these language, custom, and tradition changes, we are primarily, especially initially, talking about changes amongst the aristocracy, because, like they said, the English aristocracy, yeah, y'all can get out of here, we're bringing the Norman aristocracy in, we're in charge now. And so a lot of these changes occurred at the top first, but would, of course, over a long period of time, trickle down to the bottom, and of course, the Norman aristocracy that made their way to England would become very anglicized in certain ways. So it sort of goes both ways, but basically, a lot of changes would be coming to English soil in many different ways.
Invasions of England and fail. And the body of King Harald Hardrada was returned to Norway, and the throne passed to his sons. He would be remembered in song and saga as cruel and avaricious, and adventurous, wise, and valiant.
Yeah.
The last howl of a dark, brave, and wild age. Alright, watch this. I'm actually decent at World of Tanks.
Alright, and y'all should check out their ad. Their video will be linked down below. Give them a like, subscribe to their channel, check out their sponsor, all that good stuff. So, Harald Hardrada. Now, before this, I knew not much about him. I'll tell you what I did know. First off, I knew that he was this great and imposing warrior. I knew about his time in the Varangian Guard. I know a little bit of Byzantine history. And I knew about his role in, this whole squabble for the English crown. I'm not sure what the name for the whole conflict is, to be honest with you, but the Battle of the Stamford Bridge. And then, of course, the aftermath, the Battle of Hastings, is very, very famous. I didn't know much about Harold's rule back home. I didn't know that he was known for being so cruel, avaricious, and brutal. I guess I shouldn't be so surprised, but to be fair, as we saw, you don't want to generalize. It's not like all Viking or all Nordic or Norwegian kings were brutal, cruel. I mean, we saw Magnus the Good. He was known for his generosity and kindness. So, they weren't all as cruel and brutal as Harold. It seems like he was actually particularly cruel, and he was remembered as such, but was also remembered for being this very competent warrior, strong and fierce. And that's something that I had already heard, and it was very evident throughout this story. So yeah, also I should say, I sort of forgot to bring this up in the main video, but after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Harold dies, a few survivors make their way back. It's sort of a commonly held belief. Now, I don't know how much truth there is to this. I'm really not an expert on this time period. But the reason this video was called The Last Viking is because there is some idea that Harald Hardrada was the last Viking. After he died, the age of the Vikings sort of declined, was brought to a close, basically. And I think there's some truth to that. As they mentioned, England became way more closed off to Scandinavia, far more open to the rest of the continent. When you think about sort of the golden age of the Vikings, or whatever you want to call it, the age of the Vikings, you'll think about, around this time period and before, I would say. So I don't know how much truth there is to that. I don't know if that's necessarily accurate, but from the position of an outsider who doesn't know much about this, it does at least seem like, the prominence of the Vikings in European affairs more broadly sort of really did start to decline after the last hurrah of Harald Hardrada. Anyway, that was the other thing I had on my mind that I sort of forgot to mention after we covered the Battle of Stamford Bridge. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I very much enjoyed these two videos. Like I said, I think History Dose always does a fantastic job. Pretty underrated channel. They've got great art, great narration, Good stuff. Good stories. Like I said, this video was requested by a patron at the Professor tier. If you would like to request a reaction and guaranteed have me do it, you can subscribe at the Professor tier on Patreon. If you would like to see all the exclusive content I put out, then you can also subscribe to the Patreon or become a channel member. Either way, you can see exclusive regular reaction videos, also early access to reactions. This video went up first for channel members and patrons, and then went out publicly. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.